biggest ethical issue that has been at the forefront of the discussion about embryonic stem cell research comes from the fact that the embryo is destroyed when the stem cells are removed. And so, therefore, the first thing we need to talk about is the moral status of the human embryo. And there are three basic views, although, of course, there are subtleties in each view, but I'm just going to give you the basic views. The first view, which is the most conservative view, says that the blastocyst, the human embryo at its very earliest stage, or even the single-celled zygote after fertilization occurs, is a human person, a human subject, with all the rights of any other human subject, like anyone in this room. And the basic idea on this view is that your criterion of moral status is that the human embryo is genetically human. It has its own unique genetic code, and to flesh that out, the idea is that everybody once started as an embryo. We can trace our biological history back to the embryonic stage. Therefore, the human embryo is a person with rights, including the right to life. Now, the genetic humanity criterion has itself been challenged, as we'll see in just a moment. There is another related question, which says that even if the blastocyst has a human genetic code, there's a question about whether it is at that stage a uniquely individuated organism. And so some people who even accept the genetic humanity criterion of moral status would say that at the very early embryonic stage, it is not yet an organism, because until it becomes implanted in a uterus and gastrulation takes place and you have the primitive streak, which is the precursor of the nervous system, it can still, as Sean explained, twin. And therefore you've got two individuals, and you cannot trace back two individuals to one and say it's identical to both because of the principle of identity. So therefore, even if you accept the genetic humanity criterion, you might say that embryonic stem cell research is okay, because at the stage at which the stem cells are removed and the embryo destroyed, it is not a human organism, even though it is a human blastocyst. Do embryos have the same moral status as born human beings? Clearly some people think they do. They take it very seriously. But there's an example that comes from bioethicist George Annis that suggests that even people who say they do don't really take that view. And the example is, what if there was an IVF clinic in which there were trays of frozen embryos, and for some reason, hey, I'm a philosopher, we can make things up, there is also a 6-month-old child. And you're in the clinic, you see, and a bomb, you find out, is set to go off in the next 30 seconds, and you have time to either grab the baby or a tray of 24 frozen embryos. If you really thought that they had the same moral status, you would go, one baby, 24, right, other people, and you would have to grab the tray. But none of you would. QED. Okay, so at the next view on the status of the embryo is at the very other extreme, which is these are just tissue like any other tissue, which if it's removed from a body gets discarded. No different really from cheek cells, no different from sperm and eggs, which also, under the right circumstances, have the potential to become human beings. And the basis for this view really is the rejection of the genetic humanity criterion. So what this view says is that the fact that the embryo has its own unique genetic code is not particularly important, because species membership is not particularly important. It's not a necessary condition for full moral status, because there may be non-humans that have the morally relevant characteristics of human persons or human subjects. And if there, perhaps chimpanzees, for example. And if there aren't any actual ones, we can at least imagine ones. So fictional characters like E.T., for example. Would it be okay to chop him up and use him as hamburger or experiment on him? No, it would seem not, because he has intelligence and rationality and the capacity to communicate and the capacity to feel emotions and love and whatever else you want to build into moral personhood. The person view, as this is known, has its own problems, because depending on how many characteristics you build in order to be a moral person and have full moral status, it seems like a lot of people get left out, including babies and people with developmental disabilities and Alzheimer's disease in its advanced stages, and a lot of people that we think are people. So there is a third view, and this third view, the compromise view, says that embryos are neither persons like anyone in this room, but nor are they just stuff. And it said, this view, which I have defended in print, says that we need a third category. We need category for something that has moral importance, even though it isn't a person. This is not a unique view. Virtually every governmental commission that has examined it has embraced a version of the third view. There are critics of this view who say that we're just trying to make ourselves feel better as we prepare to kill the embryos, but there are others, and I am one of them, who think we can give some content and meaningfulness to this idea of the special respect. So, what this respect for embryos, it seems to me, in order to understand it, we have to differentiate it from the respect that's due to persons. The respect that's due to persons is in philosophy called Kantian respect, because Kant instructed us that respect for persons means never using others merely as means to our ends. We all use each other as means to ends. You're getting information from our speakers. We're getting an audience from you. But what it means to treat someone as an end in itself means to act on principles that sustain and extend one another's capacities for autonomous action. That's from philosopher Honora O'Neill. And in order to do that, we have to share and support one another's ends and activities, at least to some extent. That means for us to treat each other as we're supposed to, with respect, with acknowledging human dignity. It means not just treating other people as tools to accomplish your purposes, but also to recognize that everybody has their own interests, their own purposes, their own ends, their own projects. And so far as is possible, to help one another, insofar as those projects are morally permissible, to achieve them. Now, the reason I think that we can't have Kantian respect for embryos is because they are completely non-sentient. They don't have projects and goals. They can't even feel pain way too early in development. And so it seems to me it doesn't make sense to talk about Kantian respect. But I think that we can have a non-Kantian kind of respect for embryos, and it would be something like the respect that we have, for example, for dead bodies. Dead bodies are not simply decaying pieces of flesh, as we see from our traditions, and every culture has them, of some kind of ritual for disposing of dead bodies. Whether you think they must be buried and never burned, or must be burned and never buried, you don't just put them out with the trash. Even with the individual's consent, one of the interesting things is body worlds, but we'll get into that in discussion period. So the thing about that, though, even though we all have this notion of respect for the dead, it doesn't rule out, for example, autopsies, although in the 19th century people thought that it did. It doesn't rule out, for example, the use of cadavers in the training of medical students. Although it does mean that medical students are not supposed to throw around body parts as if they were frisbees, which they used to do, but they don't do that anymore. And at Albany Med, they have a ceremony after they use the dead bodies to show respect for the dead. So just as dead bodies are owed respect, both because what they are, the remains of a once living human person, and what they symbolize, the human person who once was among us and is no more, so too I think we can see human embryos as deserving a kind of respect, not Kantian respect, but a kind of respect. Some of them have the potential to develop into human persons, but even those that don't can be seen as a symbol of human life, which is worthy of respect in all of its stages. So what does it rule out? Well, it rules out, I think, frivolous or trivial uses of embryos. If somebody wants to do an art project using embryos, as apparently a Yale student did, or maybe she didn't, but we don't know. But if someone were going to do something like that, I think that would be crossing a line, frivolous and trivial. Or if someone were somehow able to, I don't know, make jewelry out of embryos by gluing a lot of them together, that I think would also show contempt for human life. There's no need to use human embryos in that way. However, respect for human life does not, I would argue, rule out significant research that could cure devastating diseases or save lives. Indeed, respect for human life, it seems to me, requires that. Okay. So there are some other ethical issues that I'm going to go through quite quickly. One of them, Sean mentioned a little bit, payment to egg providers. When you, in order to get stem cells, you need embryos. In order to get embryos, you need eggs, whether through IVF or human cloning. And that raises the question of should egg donors be paid. Now, in the United States, egg donors for purposes of reproduction are paid, although there's been a lot of debate about should there be limits on how much they're paid. Some people have said, okay, egg donors for reproduction, that's one thing, egg donors for research, totally different. They mustn't be paid. I don't see really why. It's the same inconvenience, burden, and risk. If you pay egg donors for reproduction, parity would seem the same. The second question is whether it is only permissible to use what are called discarded or spare or surplus embryos. And there's been a lot of discussion about that, and Obama has kept with that tradition. Federal funds can only be used for leftover embryos for IVF. The argument for this is that to create embryos for the purposes of reproduction is to show respect for them because they could be human persons. They could develop it. But if you're doing it for research, you're creating them just to destroy them, and that shows a lack of respect. I don't think it's a very good argument, and I don't think it's a good argument for the following reason. Why are there leftover embryos in IVF? And the reason is because if you create get as many eggs out of the woman as possible, fertilize all of them and freeze the ones that you can't actually implant in the woman because we don't want octuplets, then if the cycle doesn't work, you have embryos so the woman can use them again and you don't expose the woman to the additional burdens and small risk of extracting embryos, not to mention the cost. So in other words, it's the value of the project of reproduction that justifies creating extra embryos, many of which we know will be discarded ultimately. So if it's the value of the product, the end, why isn't the value of the end of medical research, ultimately, hopefully, to save lives, equally valuable? And therefore, I don't think. Now, politically, maybe a great thing to do. Ethically, though, I don't think it makes much sense. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is that these terms get misused even though there actually is a technical difference, and it's chimeras and hybrids. And people say, if you start mixing cells from different animals, whoa, who knows what you're going to get? You're going to get, I don't know, Stuart Little. You're going to get a mouse and it's going to have a human brain and it's going to be terrible. If you understand really why scientists are interested in creating chimeras, then you will understand that the reason is that if you could get a stem cell line and create tissue in a lab, you don't know if it works. You have to try it in a living organism. Okay, let's put it in people. No, you don't want to do that immediately. So they want to do it into animals. So you would be putting human cells into animals and creating a chimera. That makes a lot of sense. Are we likely to get a chimpanzee that is worried about the economy? Very, very far-fetched. Maybe there should be regulations because it's at least possible, but I think that certainly legislation that goes, absolutely we can't do this, is not only not justified, but actually irresponsible. Thank you.
I always feel guilty when Bonnie gives that example, because when it comes to the infant, the 6-month-old infant, or the, I guess, 24 embryos, and if my dog were in the room, I'd save my dog. So I'm even worse than I'm that, but I'm a lawyer. So